There is a specific sound a phone makes when it rings out to voicemail 9 times in a row, and I want you to understand that I counted. I stood on the platform at Fenwick Station with my knuckles split open and a stranger's blood drying on my sleeve, and I called my mother 9 times, and 9 times her voicemail picked up with the same cheerful message she recorded when I was 19. "Hi, you've reached Diane. I can't get to the phone right now." I hung up before the beep every single time. On the 10th call, I didn't call her. I called a woman named Dolores who worked behind the counter at an urgent care 3 blocks away, because she was the only adult who had looked me in the eye all night and asked if I was okay before asking me anything else. That was the night I stopped being the daughter who waited her turn. I am Ava Bennett. I am 31 years old. And before I tell you what happened on that platform, I need you to understand something that took me 28 years to understand myself. Some families don't fail you all at once. They fail you 9 missed calls at a time, for your whole life, until one ordinary Tuesday, the pattern finally has a name. Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth about the families that underestimated them. If stories about betrayal, backbone, and starting over speak to you, drop a comment below and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when the quiet one stops staying quiet. I was 7 the first time I understood, without having language for it yet, that I was the daughter you could set down and forget about, and Lauren was the daughter you picked up and carried. It was raining the day of Lauren's dance recital, not the kind of rain that inconveniences you, but the kind that floods the gutters and turns the school parking lot into a shallow lake. My mother, Diane, had one umbrella. I remember standing at the car with it while she walked Lauren, dressed in a sequined leotard the color of a robin's egg, from the door to the passenger seat so her costume wouldn't get spotted. I held the umbrella over my sister. I got soaked. Nobody asked if I minded. It did not occur to my 7-year-old self that anyone should have asked, because that was simply the order of things in our house. Lauren was the one whose things could not get ruined. I was the one who didn't have things that mattered enough to protect. I could tell you about the umbrella and let it stand alone, but that would be doing what my mother always did, treating a single moment as an anomaly instead of what it actually was, which was a preview. When I was 9, I won the regional spelling bee. I spelled the word chrysanthemum into a microphone in a middle school auditorium while my father, Robert, sat in the 3rd row with his hands cupped around his mouth, and my mother sat beside him checking her watch, because Lauren, who was 6, had a pediatrician appointment 40 minutes later and Diane did not want to be late. We left before they called my name for the trophy. My father went back for it 2 days later on his lunch break and brought it home wrapped in a grocery bag, quietly, like it was something to apologize for rather than something to celebrate. When I was 12, Lauren broke her arm falling off the porch railing she'd been told 4 times not to sit on. My mother took 2 weeks off work. She slept in a cot beside Lauren's bed for the first 3 nights, even though a broken arm, per the doctor, required nothing more than a cast and some ibuprofen. That same month, I had a bout of pneumonia serious enough that I missed 11 days of school. I remember lying in bed listening to my mother's voice through the wall, on the phone with her sister, saying, "Ava's a trooper, she doesn't need much fussing." I was 11 days into a fever that peaked at 103.4, and what I needed, more than fussing, was for someone to sit with me the way they sat with Lauren. Nobody did. My father came in twice a day with soup and a thermometer, and I loved him for it, but he worked 60 hours a week at the plant and Diane ran the house, and Diane had already decided, long before I was old enough to argue the point, that I was low maintenance and Lauren was not. There is a smaller memory I return to more than the bigger ones, maybe because its smallness is the point. When I was 14, our family cat, a gray tabby named Whistle who was, if I'm honest, more mine than anyone's, I was the one who fed her, who let her sleep curled against my stomach every night, got sick with a kidney condition that required a special prescription diet. My mother budgeted for it without complaint, the same way she budgeted for everything Lauren needed, and I remember feeling a small, guilty flush of gratitude that for once, something of mine was being protected the way Lauren's things always were. 6 months later, Lauren decided she wanted a hamster. My mother took her to the pet store the same week, bought a habitat, bedding, a wheel, a heat lamp, no discussion, no budget conversation, just yes. When I asked, half joking, if I could get a matching heat lamp for Whistle's carrier for the vet trips, my mother said, not unkindly, but automatically, it's just a 15-minute drive, Ava, she'll be fine. It wasn't really about the heat lamp. It was that Lauren's wants required no justification, and mine required a cost-benefit analysis, even when the actual dollar amounts were nearly identical. I didn't have language for that asymmetry at 14. I only had the feeling of it, sitting in my stomach like a swallowed stone. There was also the matter of chores, which I've come to think of, looking back, as its own quiet curriculum in Who Mattered More. I did the dishes every night from the time I was 10. Lauren was still learning the dishwasher at 16. I mowed the lawn from 12 years old on, using a push mower that jammed in wet grass, while Lauren's most demanding regular task was folding her own laundry, which she was praised for extravagantly, as though folding a t-shirt were a form of heroism. When I pointed this out once, at 17, exhausted and blunt in a way I rarely allowed myself to be, my mother told me I was being competitive with my sister, as though noticing an imbalance were the same thing as manufacturing one. That accusation, "you're being competitive," became a kind of muzzle I wore for over a decade. Every time I opened my mouth to name what I was seeing, that phrase was there to remind me that naming it would be treated as the crime, rather than whatever had caused me to notice it in the first place. By 16, I had built an entire personality around not needing things. It is, I've come to understand, one of the quieter forms of self-erasure a child can perform. You make yourself small and undemanding because you've learned that demanding things gets you nothing but the sensation of asking and being denied, and eventually asking becomes more painful than doing without. Lauren got a car for her 17th birthday, a used but reliable Honda that my parents had been saving toward for a year. I got my license the same year and was told I could use the Honda when Lauren didn't need it, which in practice meant never, because Lauren always needed it. I bought my own car 4 years later, at 21, with money I'd saved from a job at a pharmacy, and I remember how strange it felt to own something my family hadn't decided I deserved. I don't tell you these things because I want your pity. I tell you because you need the shape of the pattern before I show you the moment it finally broke, and the moment it broke had nothing, on its face, to do with any of this. It looked, from the outside, like a random act of violence on a train platform on an ordinary Tuesday in October. It was actually the last card in a house that had been leaning for 24 years. I want to tell you about the Tuesday itself carefully, because I have gone over every minute of it so many times since that I could recite it to you like a deposition, and there is a kind of dignity, I've found, in precision. Rage without precision is just noise. Rage with precision is testimony. I left the office at 6:20. I worked, at the time, as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown, which is a detail that matters later, because it is the reason I know how to build a file the way I'm about to describe one. It had been a brutal stretch of weeks, a case going to trial, my supervising attorney short-tempered, my apartment lease up for renewal at a rent I couldn't quite afford, and underneath all of it, a low hum of grief I hadn't examined too closely, because 8 months earlier my grandmother, Ruth, the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like an afterthought, had died, and I had not yet let myself feel the size of that loss. I got to Fenwick Station at 6:44. The platform was crowded, the way it always is on a weekday evening, commuters packed 3 deep near the yellow line, everyone staring at their phones or the tunnel mouth. There was a busker near the stairwell playing something slow on a saxophone, and the fluorescent lights overhead had that faint electrical hum they get when a bulb somewhere down the line is dying, and I remember the smell of the platform, hot metal and rain on concrete, because it had drizzled earlier and never quite dried. I was standing near the edge, exhausted, thinking about nothing more dramatic than whether I had eggs at home, replaying a mildly annoying exchange with my supervising attorney from that afternoon, when I felt a hand, deliberate, not accidental, not a stranger's shoulder brushing mine in a crowd, but a hand that closed and moved, on my body. I want to be precise about the 4 or 5 seconds that followed, because I have relived them enough times to know exactly how they unfolded, frame by frame, the way you know a scene from a film you've watched too many times to count. The first second was disbelief, a kind of blank, animal no that hadn't yet organized itself into thought. The second was the turn, my whole body swiveling before my mind had caught up to what my body already understood. The third second was seeing him, a man in his late 30s or early 40s, gray jacket, backpack slung over one shoulder, already pivoting away with the fluid, practiced motion of someone who had rehearsed this exit 100 times before, in 100 stations, on 100 women who never caught him at all. The fourth second was the moment something in my chest simply stopped negotiating with itself. I turned around. There was a man, maybe 40, in a gray jacket, already stepping backward into the crowd with the particular haste of someone who has done this before and has an exit plan. He did not make eye contact. He was already turning to go. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because false modesty has no place in this kind of accounting. I did not think. I did not calculate. 24 years of swallowing things, the umbrella, the spelling bee, the pneumonia, every small theft of the moment when I should have mattered and didn't, came up out of me in about 4 seconds, and I went after him. I grabbed the back of his jacket. He stumbled. I don't remember deciding to hit him, I remember my hand already moving, and then I remember the sound it made, which is not a sound I will describe to you in detail, because it isn't the point. I hit him again. I was shouting, I'm told, by the 2 witnesses who later gave statements, that I was shouting words I don't fully remember choosing, that I called him things I have never called another human being in my life. He did not fight back. He put his hands up and tried to shuffle away, and I followed him, because some door in me that had been shut for 24 years had come off its hinges entirely, and I did not know, in that moment, how to close it again. A transit officer pulled me off him. I remember his voice more than his face, steady, low, repeating okay, that's enough, step back until my body finally listened to a command that wasn't coming from inside it. 2 women who'd been standing near the ticket machines gave statements confirming what they'd seen, that he had touched me first, that I had not stopped shouting the entire time, that he had never once tried to hit me back, only to get away. One of them, an older woman in a green raincoat, touched my shoulder gently before she left and said, "Good for you, honey," which I did not know, in the moment, whether to feel proud of or ashamed of, and which I still, honestly, don't fully know how to feel about even now. That's the part that matters for what comes next, not the fight itself, but what happened in the 20 minutes after, sitting on a metal bench under fluorescent light with my hands shaking and my knuckles split, giving my statement to a transit officer named Marcus who kept his voice carefully neutral and non-judgmental in a way I was grateful for later, watching paramedics look the man over for a facial laceration and a possibly cracked rib across the platform, while I dialed my mother's number for the first time. My hands were shaking badly enough that I misdialed twice before the call actually connected. It rang out. I called again 90 seconds later. It rang out again. I called a third time. I was not, in that moment, calling for permission or comfort in any grand sense. I think, if you had asked me why I was calling, I would not have had a good answer beyond because when something happens to me, I still, after everything, reach for my mother first, the way you reach for a light switch in a room you've lived in your whole life even after you've moved the furniture. By the 4th call, I texted her, "Something happened. I'm okay but I need you to call me." Delivered. Not read. By the 7th call, a transit officer named Marcus asked if there was someone else he could call for me, and I gave him my father's number instead, and it went to voicemail too, though his was full and couldn't even take a message. By the 9th call, I stopped. I sat on that bench and I looked at my phone screen, 9 missed calls, 0 returned, 7:41 p.m. glowing at the top, and something in me went very, very quiet. Not calm. Quiet the way a house is quiet after the power goes out. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, if I had died on this platform tonight, my mother would have found out from a police officer, because she was too busy to answer her phone 9 times in 54 minutes. A woman named Dolores, who ran the front desk at an urgent care 2 blocks from the station and happened to be walking home when she saw me sitting there shaking, stopped. She didn't ask what happened first. She asked if I was hurt, and when I said my hand, she walked me to the clinic herself, sat with me while a nurse practitioner checked my knuckles for fractures, and stayed until I told her, 3 times, that I would be all right getting home on my own. I didn't know her last name for another 2 months. I think about her more than I think about almost anyone from that year. I found out later, much later, in the way these things surface, what my family had actually been doing during those 54 minutes. Lauren, 28 at the time, had just gotten engaged. My mother had been at Lauren's apartment with a bottle of Prosecco, helping her draft the guest list, phone on silent because Diane found ringers distracting during important moments. My father had been asleep in his recliner with the television on, phone charging in the other room, the way he did most nights by 7. I am not telling you this to say that celebrating an engagement is a crime. I am telling you this because it is the exact shape of my entire childhood compressed into 54 minutes. Lauren's moment took precedence, automatically, without anyone deciding it should, because the family had decided that a decade before either of them was even in the room. I did not confront anyone that week. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story where the wounded daughter shows up screaming at the family dinner table is a satisfying story, but it isn't what happened, and it isn't, I've come to believe, how real change starts. Real change, in my experience, starts quietly, on your own terms, when you finally stop performing the role you've been cast in. I went to my parents' house 4 days later. My hand was still bruised, my mother still hadn't called, she'd texted, eventually, on Wednesday morning, "Sorry missed your calls, everything okay?" And I let myself in with the key I'd had since I was 16, and I packed the last of my childhood belongings that were still in my old room, a box of yearbooks, a jewelry box my grandmother Ruth had given me, a stack of photographs I wanted before anyone else got the idea to divide them up. I left a note on my old pillow, because I did not trust myself, at that point, to say what I needed to say out loud without it turning into something louder and less useful than the truth. It said, "I called 9 times. Nobody answered. I'm not writing this to punish you, I'm writing it because I need you to know that I noticed, and that I'm done pretending I don't. I love you. I'm also done waiting to matter to you. I'll reach out when I'm ready. Please don't call me before then. Ava." I did not slam a door. I did not raise my voice. I drove home, put the box in my closet, and did not speak to my mother for the next 5 weeks. It was, up to that point in my life, the single hardest and most honest thing I had ever done. I want to describe the drive home, because it has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else from that period. It was dusk, the sky doing that particular October thing where the light goes the color of a bruise, and I remember gripping the steering wheel with my still tender hand and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, something that wasn't quite peace but was adjacent to it, a kind of clean, exhausted relief, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you'd forgotten you were carrying. I did not know, that night, whether my mother would call the moment she found the note, or whether she would honor what I'd asked and wait. She waited, as it turned out, exactly 4 days before the first text, and then respected the boundary after that, mostly, with a handful of anxious exceptions I chose to let go of. That surprised me. I had expected either total silence or total intrusion, and got neither, which was its own strange kind of information about who my mother actually was underneath the habits she'd built. Those 5 weeks were not comfortable. I missed my father, who I knew was caught in the middle and hurting in his own quiet way, unaware yet of why any of this was happening. I missed the parts of my mother that were genuinely good, her laugh, the way she used to hum while she cooked, the birthday cards she'd send with too many exclamation points. But I did not call. I let the missing sit in me without acting on it, because I had spent 24 years mistaking my own tolerance for love, and I needed, finally, to find out what was underneath the tolerance once I stopped offering it automatically. I want to back up now, to my grandmother, because you cannot understand the second half of this story without understanding her first. Ruth Bennett was my father's mother, a sharp, precise woman who had worked 40 years as a bookkeeper before retiring, and who possessed, unlike everyone else in my family, an actual talent for noticing me. She was the one who came to my spelling bee awards 2 days late and made my father tell the whole story over dinner as though the trophy itself deserved a seat at the table. She was the one who sent me a card, every single year, on the anniversary of the day I'd had pneumonia, that said only, "Thinking of my tough girl. Love, Grandma." I never understood, until much later, why that particular date mattered to her so much. Ruth died in February, 8 months before the platform. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. I sat with her more than anyone else in the family did in her final 6 weeks, not because I was told to, but because I wanted to, and because in the hospice room, for the first time in my adult life, I felt like the daughter who mattered. 2 weeks before she died, lucid but frail, she told me something I didn't understand at the time. She was holding my hand, and she said, very quietly, "Ava, when the papers come, you look at the box marked 1995. Don't let your mother sort them first." I thought it was the medication talking. I did not ask her what she meant, because I was 28 years old and telling myself my grandmother was dying and I did not want to spend our last conversations chasing riddles. I regret that now more than almost anything. She left me, in her will, a modest inheritance, not more than Lauren or my father received, which surprised no one, since Ruth had always been scrupulously, almost aggressively fair in a family that otherwise wasn't. But she also left me something stranger, a locked file box, the kind you'd keep tax documents in, with a note taped to the top that said only, "For Ava, when she's ready." Not before. I did not open it for 7 months. It sat in my closet, beside the box from my old bedroom, through the entire ordeal with the platform and the missed calls and the pillow note. I opened it, finally, on a Sunday in November, 3 weeks into my silence with my mother, because I woke up that morning with Ruth's voice in my head, the box marked 1995, and I could not shake it. The file box held, among other things, old tax records, a handful of photographs, and a manila folder labeled in Ruth's precise bookkeeper's handwriting, 1995, Diane/R. Inside were 4 things. A hospital bill from a clinic 2 towns over, dated March 1995, 8 months before I was born, in my mother's maiden name. A handwritten letter, unsent, in my mother's handwriting, addressed to a man named Russell Ferris, my father's younger brother, who had died in a car accident when I was 2, a man I knew only from a single photograph on my grandmother's mantel. A copy of a paternity test result, dated June 1996, the year after Lauren was born, with 2 names on it, Robert Bennett, excluded, Russell Ferris, not excluded. And a note from Ruth herself, dated 3 years ago, clearly written for whoever eventually opened this box. I have known since Lauren was a baby. Diane told me the truth once, drunk and frightened, the year Russell died, and made me promise never to tell Robert. I kept that promise because it was not mine to break, and because by then Robert loved Lauren as his own and I would not take that from either of them. But I could not stay silent about what it cost you, Ava. I watched your mother spend 25 years overcorrecting, giving Lauren everything, protecting her from every hurt, because some broken part of Diane believed that loving Lauren enough could undo the lie. And you paid for that debt without ever knowing you owed it. You did nothing wrong. You were simply born to a mother who was too afraid of losing what she'd built to ever look at what she'd cost you. I am sorry I did not find a way to say this to your face. I love you exactly as much as I ever loved her, and I need you, someday, to know that. I sat on my kitchen floor and read that letter 4 times. I want to tell you it made everything make sense in some clean, satisfying way, but grief and clarity rarely arrived together. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of vertigo, 28 years of why does she treat Lauren differently suddenly answered by a truth so large it swallowed the question whole. My mother had spent my entire childhood atoning to Lauren for a secret Lauren didn't even know she carried, and I had spent my entire childhood as the collateral cost of that atonement, without ever once being told why. I sat with it for 3 days before I told anyone. I went to work, I answered emails, I sat through a deposition prep session and took notes in handwriting so steady no one in that room could have guessed what was folded up inside me. At night, though, I lay awake reorganizing my whole childhood around this new fact, the way you'd reorganize a room around a piece of furniture you hadn't realized was load-bearing. The umbrella. The spelling bee. The pneumonia. The hamster and the heat lamp. None of it had ever really been about whether I was likable or Lauren was, the way I'd quietly believed, in some shamed corner of myself, for 28 years. It had been about a debt my mother believed she owed a dead man's memory and a daughter who never knew she was the interest payment. There was grief in it too, a strange, delayed grief for Russell Ferris, a man I had never really known, whose only trace in my childhood had been a photograph on my grandmother's mantel and a story my father told rarely and always a little too briskly, the way people talk about losses they haven't finished having. I understood, suddenly, why Ruth had kept the anniversary card each year on the date of my pneumonia, not because the illness itself mattered to her especially, but because, I would later realize, that illness had fallen in the same week as Russell's death anniversary, and Ruth, grieving her younger son in silence every year while everyone else moved through the date unbothered, had found some way to let her love for me stand in for the parts of her grief she couldn't say out loud to anyone else. My father, I understood immediately, did not know. And that changed everything about how I would need to handle what came next. I sat for a long while with the single photograph of Russell Ferris that had been tucked into the folder, younger than my father by 3 years, with the same wide jaw and easy, unguarded smile, standing at what looked like a company picnic with his sleeves rolled up, laughing at something outside the frame. I had grown up believing he was little more than a name attached to a tragedy, a car accident on a rainy stretch of Route 9 that no one in my family liked to discuss in any detail. Now I understood why the discomfort had always run deeper than ordinary grief. Every time Russell's name came up at a holiday table, my mother had gone quiet in a particular way I'd noticed my whole life and never questioned. I had simply filed it, the way children file most adult behavior, under "that's just how she is." I called my friend Priya that night, one of the two people, along with Dolores, who make up what I've come to think of as my quiet support system, the people who showed up for me the family never did. Priya and I had worked together for 4 years. She was the person who'd sat with me in a stairwell during the worst week of the trial prep, who texted me every October 7th, the anniversary of the platform, just to say thinking of you, no reply needed. She was also, not incidentally, sharper than anyone I knew about reading a document for what it wasn't saying. I read her Ruth's letter over the phone. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the thing that reframed the entire next 6 weeks of my life. "Ava, you build files professionally. You know how to find corroborating documents. If you're going to do anything with this, tell your dad, confront your mom, anything, you need more than one letter from a grieving woman. You need a record." She was right, and it was, I think, the most useful thing anyone said to me that year, because it gave my grief a job to do. Grief without a task will eat you. Grief with a task becomes something closer to purpose. I am a paralegal. I know how to build a record, and over the next month, in the evenings after work, I built one. I requested my own birth certificate and Lauren's, side by side, and noted the 18-month gap between us that had always seemed unremarkable until it wasn't. I found, through a records request Priya walked me through, the county marriage license for my parents, dated a full year before Lauren's paternity would have been questioned by anyone doing the math, proof, at least, that Diane and Robert's marriage predated the affair, which mattered later, in ways I hadn't expected, for how gently I would eventually need to handle my father. I found an old photograph, one my grandmother had kept, of Russell Ferris at a 4th of July barbecue the summer before Lauren was born, and set it beside a photograph of Lauren at 22. The resemblance, once I was looking for it, was not subtle. I kept copies of everything in a folder on my laptop, backed up twice, and printed a hard copy that I kept, appropriately I thought, in the same kind of file box Ruth had used. I named the folder, without much ceremony, the Missed Calls file, because that was where this had started, on a bench at Fenwick Station with my phone lit up and no one answering, and because I wanted, whenever I opened it, to remember exactly what I was building the record to finally be free of. It took me 5 weeks. I was not frantic about it. I want to stress that, Because there is a version of this kind of investigation that curdles into obsession, and I was careful not to let it. I worked on it 2 evenings a week, methodically, the way I'd build a case file at the office, a Tuesday and a Thursday, usually, after dinner, laptop open at my kitchen table with a single lamp on, the way I imagine a detective in an old film might work a cold case, except my cold case was my own childhood. Some of the corroboration came easier than I expected. County records requests, it turns out, are a fairly bureaucratic and unglamorous process. You fill out a form, you pay a small fee, you wait. The marriage license took 11 days. The old newspaper archive where I found a small announcement of Russell Ferris's death, a car accident on Route 9, the same accident I'd always been told about only in the vaguest terms, took an afternoon at the library, scrolling through microfilm with a librarian named Grace who, when I finally found the article, quietly brought me a cup of water without my asking. Another small kindness from a stranger that I've never forgotten. The hardest piece was the photograph comparison. I spent an entire Thursday evening laying printed photos of Russell and of Lauren side by side at different ages, feeling something close to vertigo each time the resemblance sharpened instead of faded. I also, during those 5 weeks, did something I hadn't originally planned to. I called my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, who had always been kind to me in a distant, occasional holiday card kind of way. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I only asked, carefully, whether she remembered anything unusual about the year before Lauren was born. There was a long pause on the line before she said, "Ava, why are you asking me this now?" in a voice that told me, without her saying another word, that I was not the first person in this family to have wondered. The rest of the time I lived my life, I went to therapy for the first time, started seeing someone the following spring, let myself, slowly, imagine a version of my future that didn't hinge on my mother's approval. By early December, I had what I needed, and I had to decide what to do with it. My first instinct, I'll admit, was fury dressed up as justice, some fantasy of laying the paternity test on the Thanksgiving table in front of the whole family and watching it detonate. I sat with that fantasy for about a week before I recognized it for what it was, a way of making my mother feel, in one violent instant, the way I'd felt on that platform. Understandable. Not, in the end, what I actually wanted. What I wanted, and it took me a long time and a good therapist to get honest with myself about this, was not revenge. It was acknowledgement. I wanted my mother to say, out loud, in words, that she had seen the imbalance and chosen it anyway, and that it was not my fault, and that I had not imagined 24 years of feeling like an afterthought. I wanted my father to know the truth, not to punish him with it, but because he deserved to stop loving a daughter under false pretenses he never consented to. And I wanted, whatever came after, to walk away from that room able to build a life that didn't depend on any of them ever getting it right. I thought a great deal, in those final weeks of planning, about what my grandmother would have wanted me to do with what she'd left me. She had carried this secret for almost 30 years to protect a family that, in some ways, had never quite protected her back. Ruth had spent her whole life being the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one nobody worried about, not so different, I realized with a small jolt, from the role I'd been cast in myself. I didn't want to honor her memory by turning her carefully guarded secret into a weapon. I wanted to honor it by finally telling the truth the way she would have, if she'd ever found the courage, plainly, without cruelty, in a room where everyone could hear it at the same time and no one could rewrite the story afterward in private. I chose neutral ground on purpose, not the family kitchen, where every fight we'd ever had happened, but a private room at a restaurant Ruth used to like, 3 weeks before Christmas. I invited my mother, my father, and Lauren, separately, each with the same message: I need to talk to all 3 of you together. It's important. I love you. Please come. I did not tell them why. I did not want an ambush disguised as fairness. I wanted a conversation I could control the shape of, because I had spent my whole life letting other people control the shape of mine. They were all there when I arrived, which surprised me a little. My mother in the blue coat she'd had for a decade, my father restless in his chair, Lauren checking her phone, engagement ring catching the light. I sat down across from all 3 of them, put the file box on the table, and did not open it yet. I want to start, I said, by telling you about a Tuesday in October. I told them about the platform. I told them, in the same flat, precise tone Marcus the transit officer had used taking my statement, about the man's hand, about hitting him, about not remembering deciding to. I watched my mother's face go pale. Ava, I had no idea it was that bad. You texted that you were okay. I called 9 times, I said. You didn't pick up once. Neither did Dad. I sat on a bench with split knuckles and called my parents 9 times in 54 minutes, and the person who finally helped me was a stranger named Dolores who I'd never met before in my life. My mother started to cry. Lauren reached for her hand automatically, the old reflex, comfort Lauren first, and I watched it happen in real time, that instinct, and something in me that might once have detonated at the sight of it instead just felt tired. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty about one bad night, I said. I'm telling you because that night is when I finally understood something I'd felt my whole life and never had proof of. So I went looking for proof. I opened the box. I laid out the hospital bill first. Then the unsent letter. Then the paternity test, sliding it across the table so it sat directly in front of my father, not my mother. The room went so quiet I could hear the kitchen through the wall. My father picked it up. I watched him read it twice. I watched 29 years reorganize themselves behind his eyes. Diane, he said, and his voice was not loud, which somehow made it worse. Is this real? My mother did not deny it. I will give her that, whatever else I have to say about her, she did not, in that room, lie to his face. I was going to tell you, she said, which was, I noted silently, not the same thing as I'm sorry, and not the same thing as yes. 29 years, my father said. You were going to tell me for 29 years. Lauren had gone white. Wait, she said. Wait, what does this mean? What is this? It means Dad isn't your biological father, I said, as gently as I could manage, because whatever grievances I carried into that room, Lauren had walked in not knowing any of this either, and I had promised myself, going in, that I would not make her collateral damage the way I had been. Russell Ferris was Dad's brother. Mom, is that right? My mother nodded, once, and put her face in her hands. I need you to understand why I'm telling all of you this together, I said, and I made myself keep my voice level, the way I'd practiced it in the car on the way over. Not to punish anyone. I found out because Grandma Ruth left me a file the year before she died, she knew, and she carried it alone for almost 30 years to protect this family, and it cost her something I don't think any of us fully appreciated while she was alive. What I need to say, and I need to say it directly, is this, Mom, I think you've spent my whole childhood trying to make up for a secret none of us knew we were living inside of. You gave Lauren everything because some part of you was terrified that if you didn't, the truth would surface and you'd lose her, or lose Dad, or lose the story you'd built. And I paid for that. Every birthday, every recital, every time I got sick and nobody sat with me, I paid a debt I didn't know I owed. That's not, Ava, I never stopped loving you. I know, I said, and I meant it, which surprised me even as I said it. I don't think you stopped loving me. I think you were so afraid of losing what you'd built with Lauren that you couldn't see what it cost me to keep giving her the bigger share. I'm not asking you to grovel. I'm asking you to say, out loud, that you saw it. That it wasn't in my head. There was a long silence. My mother looked at me, really looked at me, in a way I don't think she had in years, and said, quietly, you're right. I saw it. I told myself you didn't need as much, because that was easier than admitting I was giving Lauren more because I was scared. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix 29 years in one dinner, but I see it. I saw it then, too. I just didn't let myself stop. Why didn't you just tell him? I asked her, and I wasn't trying to be cruel, I genuinely wanted to understand the architecture of 30 years of silence. Any point in 29 years. Why let it get this far? My mother wiped her eyes and was quiet for a long moment before she answered. Because every year that passed made it a bigger lie instead of a smaller one, she said. The first year, I told myself I'd tell him once Lauren could handle knowing. Then I told myself once your father and Russell's falling out healed, they hadn't spoken much after the accident. Did you know that? There was so much unresolved grief there already. Then I told myself it didn't matter anymore because he loved her the same either way. I kept finding a new reason every single year, and none of the reasons were about protecting anyone but me. I know that now. I didn't let myself know it then. And Ava, my father said, still holding the paternity test, his voice rougher now. Where does she fit into 30 years of reasons? My mother looked at me, and for the first time in the whole dinner, she didn't have an answer ready. I don't think I let myself see what it was doing to her, she finally said. I think some part of me knew that if I really looked at how I was treating Ava differently, I'd have to ask myself why, and the why led straight back to this. It was easier to tell myself she was just low maintenance. It was easier than admitting I was choosing to give more to the child I felt guiltiest about. That's not easier, I said. That's just quieter. It cost the same amount. It just cost me instead of you. It was not a perfect apology. It did not undo anything. But it was the first time in my life my mother had ever admitted, plainly, that the imbalance had been a choice and not my imagination, and I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't realized had been clenched for 3 decades. My father set the paternity test down very carefully, like it might break. I need some time, he said, to no one in particular, and then, to me, thank you for not doing this at Christmas dinner. Lauren was crying by then, and to my surprise, she reached across the table, not toward our mother, this time, but toward me. I didn't know, she said. Ava, I swear to God I didn't know any of this. I don't even know what to say to you. You don't have to say anything, I told her. None of this is your fault. I need you to understand that clearly, because I don't want you carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry. You were a kid getting loved. That was never the problem. The problem was that loving you seemed to require not seeing me. It was Lauren, of everyone at that table, who said the thing I hadn't realized I needed to hear. I used to feel guilty, she said, quietly, when we were kids. I used to feel like I got things I hadn't earned, and I didn't know why, and I never said anything because I didn't want to lose it. I'm sorry I never asked why. I'm sorry I let it be normal. We did not resolve everything at that table. My father left first, quiet and shaken, and did not speak to my mother for almost 2 months afterward. My mother and I did not hug at the end of dinner, and I did not expect to. But when I stood up to leave, she said, Ava. 9 calls. I am never going to forgive myself for not picking up, and for the first time in my adult life, I believed that she meant it. I want to tell you that everything was fixed after that dinner, but that would be a lie, and I promised you honesty at the start of this, so I'll give you the truth instead. Repair is slower and clumsier than confrontation, and far less cinematic. My parents separated for 4 months while my father worked through what he'd learned, and eventually, to my surprise, chose to stay together, not because the truth stopped mattering, but because, as he told me once, quietly, over coffee, I raised her. That part was never a lie, even if the beginning of it was. He and Lauren are, if anything, closer now than they were before, which I did not expect and am glad for. My mother started therapy the January after that dinner, on her own, without me suggesting it, which mattered to me more than almost anything else she did in that first year. I had spent so much of my life watching her make choices in reaction to other people's needs that a choice she made purely for her own reckoning felt, strangely, like one of the first honest things I'd seen from her in a long time. We talk now, most weeks, though there are still nights she calls and I let it go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I am still learning that I am allowed to have limits with her, and that having them does not make me the villain of this story. She still, occasionally, catches herself mid-habit. I remember a Sunday in the spring when Lauren mentioned offhand that she'd forgotten her umbrella, and my mother, out of pure reflex, started to say take mine, and then stopped, looked at me, and said instead, Ava, do you need one too? It was such a small thing. I don't think anyone else at that table understood why my eyes filled up over an umbrella. I moved into a new apartment that spring, my name only on the lease, furnished slowly with things I chose because I liked them, not because they were handed down or approved of. It was a small one-bedroom above a bakery, and I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, listening to the ovens running downstairs, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, exactly, but a kind of settled quiet, the feeling of a room that belonged entirely to me and to no one's expectations. Priya helped me paint the living room a deep, warm terracotta that my mother, visiting for the first time months later, would call a lot, in the same tone she used to use for anything Lauren wanted that I didn't get to have, except this time I just said, "I like it," and let the sentence be enough, without needing her to agree. Dolores, whom I'd stayed in touch with, came to the small housewarming I threw that June, and cried a little when I told the small group of people gathered there what her 20 minutes on a bad night had meant to me. She brought a plant, a hardy little pothose, and told me it was nearly impossible to kill, which felt, at the time, like the nicest metaphor anyone had ever handed me disguised as a housewarming gift. I started dating someone that summer, a man named Theo, patient in a way I hadn't let myself be around before, someone who noticed when I flinched at small things, a missed text, a cancelled plan, and never once made me explain myself before he adjusted. When I told him the whole story, the platform, the file, the dinner, over a slow dinner at his apartment, he didn't flinch or try to fix it. He just listened, all the way through, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That explains a lot about why you check twice before you let people matter to you." He was right, and I loved him a little more for noticing instead of minimizing. My relationship with Lauren changed the most, I think, of anyone's. We started getting coffee once a month, just the two of us, something we had genuinely never done before in our entire lives as sisters. She apologized more than once for things that weren't hers to apologize for, and each time I told her the same thing, that I didn't need her guilt, I needed her honesty, and that she'd already given me that at the dinner table when it counted. Slowly, without either of us naming it, we became something we'd never quite managed to be as kids, not just sisters by circumstance, but something closer to friends. The following spring, Lauren asked me to come to her final dress rehearsal before her wedding, not the wedding itself, but a smaller thing, a run-through of the ceremony at the venue, where the wedding party stood in for real. It was raining that day, the kind of steady gray rain that flooded gutters, and as we all walked from the parking lot to the venue door, I watched my mother automatically reach for her umbrella and open it, and then, instead of walking straight to Lauren the way 20 years of instinct would have dictated, she turned first to me. "Ava," she said, holding it out, "you're closest to the wind side. Take it." It is such a small thing to have mattered as much as it did. I stood there in the rain for a second too long before I took it, because I was busy noticing, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that the moment I had spent my whole childhood watching pass me by had finally, all these years later, circled back around and landed differently. I held the umbrella. Lauren, laughing, ducked under it with me instead of waiting for her own, and for a few seconds, on a wet Tuesday parking lot that mirrored a wet Tuesday parking lot from 24 years before, we were just two sisters getting rained on together, sharing the same shelter, and nobody was keeping score. I don't want to oversell that moment into more than it was. It didn't erase the umbrella from when I was 7. Nothing could, and I don't think it should. But it proved something I needed proof of, that the pattern could break. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But it could break. Later that afternoon, once the rehearsal was finished and everyone had scattered to change out of damp shoes, my mother found me alone in the venue's small side garden, where I'd gone to get a few minutes of quiet. She didn't apologize again. I think she understood, by then, that repeated apology had started to feel more like a performance for her own comfort than anything useful for me. Instead she just stood beside me for a while, watching the rain ease into a drizzle, and said, "I used to think being a good mother meant making sure nobody ever felt what I felt as a kid, overlooked, like an afterthought. I didn't realize for a long time that I'd just handed that feeling to someone else instead of getting rid of it. I didn't have a tidy response for that. I just reached over and took her hand, briefly, the way you might acknowledge a truth too large to fully resolve in a 5-minute conversation, and we stood there together until Lauren came to find us, hairspray in hand, laughing about something the officiant had said, pulling us both back toward the noise of the family without either of us letting go first. You are allowed to notice the pattern before you can prove it. I spent 24 years being told, implicitly, that if I couldn't point to a single dramatic betrayal, I had no right to my resentment. I was wrong to believe that. 100 small unfairnesses are still unfairness, even without a smoking gun. Sometimes the body keeps the ledger even when you don't. I didn't decide, on that platform, to finally fight back after a lifetime of swallowing things. My body decided for me. I've since learned that's common, that restraint has a limit, and when it breaks, it rarely breaks over the thing that actually caused it. Leaving quietly is still leaving. I never screamed at my family. I wrote a note and packed a box. That was enough. You do not owe anyone a dramatic exit to make your boundary real. The people who show up during your worst 20 minutes tell you more than the people who share your blood. Dolores knew me for less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. She showed me more real care in that time than certain family members managed in 3 decades. A secret rarely explains itself, it usually explains someone else's behavior instead. I didn't go looking for the paternity test to understand my mother's choices with Lauren. I went looking because Ruth told me to. It ended up explaining almost everything I'd spent my life confused about. Confrontation works best when you've already decided you don't need the outcome to be perfect. I didn't go to that dinner expecting my parents to fall apart or reunite or say exactly the right thing. I went because I needed to say my piece out loud, once, at a table I controlled. What happened after that was never mine to manage. Healing shows up in small, unglamorous moments, not grand ones. It wasn't the confrontation that told me things had changed. It was an umbrella, held out to me first, on an ordinary rainy Tuesday, 24 years after the first one. You can hold someone accountable and still refuse to make them the villain of your entire story. My mother's choices cost me a great deal, and I said so plainly, at a table, with evidence in front of her. But I also let her be a full, complicated person capable of change, because flattening her into a cartoon would have only kept me tethered to the version of my childhood where I had no power at all, and I was done being powerless in my own story. Thank you for sitting with this one with me. These stories take a while to put together, and every comment tells me they're worth continuing. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments, I read every one. And if you've ever been the quiet one in your own family, the one who held the umbrella while someone else stayed dry, subscribe, because there are more of these stories coming, and I think you'll recognize yourself in some of them.